How did the left find itself, broadly speaking, in the position it is now with certain zones of a lot of power and broad political defeat, really up until the time of maybe some sparks and shoots with Occupy in some ways, maybe some sparks and shoots with Black Lives Matter in some ways, maybe some sparks and shoots with Bernie, but overall, real retreat?
That's a big question. I'm glad you asked it. My show aims to try to, address that in bits and pieces. So I'll take a crack at it.
Yep.
Yeah, I think in the 1960s, at the height of left power, when union density was at record highs, we were at the height of the civil rights movement. You had Black Power. You had a lot of the ethnic-based radicalism that you see. The Young Lords in New York City is a big part of that, and other groups. The women's movement, for sure, the women's liberation movement, the gay liberation movement, are all at their height in the 1960s and 70s at various times. And during that time, discrimination, anti-discrimination, was very much linked with this aim to end exploitation, economic exploitation,
Right.
because the idea was that there's no use in fighting oppression and discrimination, right? There's no use in having ideal freedoms in the world if you don't have the capacities to use those freedoms. And as we all know, one of the primary things that folks need in this world are good jobs, good wages, benefits, and other social protections, right? Because if you can't feed yourself, you certainly can't enjoy the freedoms of equality, right?
Right.
And so there's a tie there, right, between anti-discrimination, anti-oppression, and anti-exploitation, pro-labor. Right. There's this social democratic ethos. Let's remember, right, the March on Washington was a march on Washington for jobs and justice.
That's right.
Right.
Yep.
Jobs
right?
And
justice.
You don't see the jobs part on that, U.S. postage stamp these days much,
Right.
do you?
Right.
You
exactly.
see this real sanitized MLK who's smiling at the racialized children. You don't see MLK at the strike in Memphis. The sanitation workers strike,
Right.
Where he was ultimately murdered.
Right.
That MLK has been whitewashed from history, literally whitewashed from history.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so what I'm getting at is that the 1970s and 80s saw a worldwide decline in capitalist production, right? You have the restructuring of industrial, manufacturing across the world. This falls under a lot of headings, whether it's globalization, outsourcing. There was a profit squeeze. You saw mass inflation that came from the phenomenon of stagflation, which is this paradoxical relationship of a co-appearance rather of stagnation, so economic stagnation and inflation. So usually those two don't happen together. Usually they offset one another. But in the 1970s, there was this perfect storm that provoked both economic stagnation, so low growth, right, and monetary inflation. So there was less work. People were getting fired from their jobs. And at the same time, the value of their money was going down.
Right.
Because it costs more money to buy the same thing under conditions of inflation. And during that time, you saw that massive trade union defeats.
Right.
Because when the jobs are being outsourced, the workers lose the capacity to fight back against the bosses, and they have to take modified contracts.
Right.
And so despite some of the most intense trade union militancy in modern history in the late 1960s and even into the 1970s, workers had to accept concessionary contract after concessionary contract until you get to the 1980s. And everybody knows about the 1980s, right? You got Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher ushering in this just inhuman, violent form of authoritarian neoliberalism starting in 1980, 1981 with the PATCO air traffic controller workers strike. It really set the example here in the United States. In the UK, Margaret Thatcher put a bunch of coal miners in jail.
Right.
When the coal miners decided to stand up to her. And so that was really throwing down the gauntlet. And we've honestly had our asses handed to us, for the past 35, 40 some odd years. So it's a serious time of defeat. So during that time, we're really skipping over a lot of history, but during that time, you see this decoupling of anti-discrimination and anti-exploitation.
Right.
Right. And so when we joke on the woke center, right, this
Right.
neoliberal woke center, the Hillary Clintons of the world, the Peter Dows of the world, the Joy Reids of the world, right?
Right.
That's what we're talking about. We're talking about this ideology where anti-oppression has been completely decoupled from economic necessities. Moreover, you could even argue that they would say that actually fighting economic oppression somehow detracts from our anti-racist pursuits.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That you have to fight each individually.
Versus being, and I think that this is incredibly, I mean, just there's a lot of nuances in this conversation, and we're going to get to single payer in a moment, but that there's sort of, there's different tracks we can take. There's and I know, and we'll get to it in future conversations and I'm hope to have him on myself. There's this, Adolf Reed critique of basically almost like movements that have the sort of imagery and kind of iconography of radicalism, but actually are in a certain sense more analogous in terms of actual politics or political demands to, like, you know, each ethnic bloc needs to create its own machine networks. And that was very persuasive in political science across the board in the 50s and 60s. This notion that, like, Irish and Italian or Jewish or other, like, marginalized immigrant groups, they established systems of patronage inside urban networks. And that's how you sort of acquire status and power, so that there's this paradoxical relationship between, and then, in some sort of rhetoric of nationalism. But then on the other hand, the tradition that has been totally decoupled that you're talking about is you go back to MLK, or globally, the African National Congress, which I use a lot.
For sure.
It was
Big time.
actually the
Anti-colonial movement, Bayard Rustin,
Baird Rustin, and the Pullman Porters Union. These were the synthesis of that there is a process that's happening at the same time, and there is multiple levels working between, the reality of, racial discrimination and oppression that happens, whether it's legally through redlining, policing, blocking people in public space, all of the scars and realities of racism in America, and then also connected and overlapping with economic exploitation, which is connected, but also connected to much broader system of exploitation generally. That was why, an MLK that's been whitewashed said quite robustly that he was a democratic socialist. So the reason that we're critiquing this woke center is because, first of all, it's a cynical deployment of a bastardization of very important and vital insight on fighting things like racism. But also, secondly, that by decoupling it from a broader critique of exploitation basically just leads to a certain version of neoliberal politics where the fight is between, the white nationalist capitalists, Trump and co., and they want to have boardrooms of all white guys, and then neoliberals who, compared to them, yeah, of course, boardrooms that are diverse are better, but nothing on the fact that, ungodly amounts of children live in poverty, nothing on housing, nothing on a broader effort of decommodification. And then all of a sudden, these absolutely essential liberatory struggles start to get warped to undermine a broader project. And you could touch on that and then maybe open up to single payer, because that is the sort of to me, that's the distillation. What Bernie's doing, and the fact that, centrists and cautious liberals are having to come along with him and ignore the Hillary Clinton carping. It's so essential because, not just because, of course, every single man, woman, child, needs, I mean, I want global single payer healthcare, right? Like, that's my politics. I want everybody from Kurdistan to,
internationalism.
Internationalist. Every single person on the planet should have high quality, universal, deliverable, free healthcare, period. But that when we open up that space of moral imagination, that's the left also starting to say again, we don't just need to fight college campus battles or inside our smaller zones of influence. We can start taking on the broader structures of every type of oppression and exploitation imaginable and open up our own strategic space. Because the other thing that's missing on the left is a sense of strategy, because the sense of what's possible to gain has been so limited.
That's right. I mean, to put it in a word, you could say marginality has been our home on the left for so long that our temporary refuge on the left has been marginality, a state of marginality for so long that we've forgotten that we should be aspiring to universality.
Right.
Right. And this is kind of my slogan, right? Socialism for regular ass people.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? We got to win the normies, man. We have to win the Joe Schmoes. The Twitter people are great. Big ups to the fam out there, the Michael Brooks show Twitter heads and
always
and the Dead Pundits Facebook crew and all the rest. I mean, we love all of you, but we're not going to win socialism. Hell, we're not even going to win like a milquetoast social democracy with just you all.
Right.
You're
the vanguard, though. Big up to.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We wouldn't be doing this if we didn't believe that to be true.
Hell no.
We're building we're building the base for this movement, brick by brick. But our audience, right, as we do that, has to be regular ass people, man. Just Joe Blow and Susie Q and whoever else, out there on the street. So I want to touch on a couple of things. Going back, a perfect illustration of what you just talked about with the co-optation of these liberatory discourses, right, is that this woke centrism, this woke neoliberal centrism is what I call it, is a project. It's a political project. It's all about making racial and gender-based movements safe for capitalism, right? Mm-hmm. So that we can achieve a modicum of equality along lines of gender, sexuality, limited ethnicity, certainly race, but keep the mode of capitalist exploitation intact and keep it safe.
Right.
This class-based violence, right?
Yes.
Intact, and keep that engine churning, right? And so they've really bastardized that in a lot of ways. And one of the historical examples you can look back to is I like to look at this because it's not just about like really bad people doing bad things. The history, how this happens, right? Before you get to the Joy Reids and the Hillary Clintons of the world, you have well-intentioned people who are put in impossible structural positions. For example, there's a wave of black mayors who are elected to inner cities in the 1960s and 70s.
Right.
You have mayors in Chicago, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., places like that. And we're thinking, these are products of the civil rights movement. These are products of black power in some instances.
Right. No, these are the real leaders committed to
political
radical racial economic transformation. And then they find themselves in the context of a global supply chain. Yeah.
Absolutely. And they're mayors, and what they end up doing is instituting, against their will, brick by brick, instituting neoliberal reform policies in their own cities against their will, because there are these constraints, right? Political, economic, social, all the rest of them that are ushered in. And I think, your show, I love your show so much because it mimics, it echoes my aim to try to understand those contradictions, right? To try to understand those structural constraints so we know how to overcome them next time around.
Right, exactly. So then, and then the process starts to become so. And actually, this was echoed recently. And I read an interview with Bill De Blasio of all people, and it was fascinating because, and actually, you could see how the rhetoric has changed because he used to be, totally adamant that what he was doing on the housing crisis and inequality in New York, that his sort of like give developers subsidies and then make them do some sort of vaguely quasi-affordable units and high-rises was like the best way to go and actually a great progressive advance. What he said in his recent interviews, he had actually a lot more sort of like, I'm not going to even attempt to paraphrase, but the tone was much more like, yeah, this really sucks. Real estate has us by the balls. There actually could be things that are a lot better, but they're just not on tap right now. And I think that, and then there's also the bridge between, and you see this again to connect it globally. I mean, how many look at a leader like, Michael Manley, who I'm working on an illicit history on, the, charismatics, brilliant Jamaican prime minister in the 1970s on actually a very modest program of genuine social democracy, and then even just sort of like a very important cultural product of like detoxifying racism, discouraging beauty pageants that, had colorism in them, and also hosting, all of this stuff. And then also saying like, we're not going to become Cuba, but we're friends with Castro. And if Kissinger comes here and lectures me, I'm not going to subordinate Jamaican foreign policy to his demands. Then the CIA floods the country with weapons. The IMF puts a squeeze on it, and then by the late '80s, when Manley comes back to power, he's giving speeches where the U.S. ambassador is observing, and he's giving a campaign rally, and this radical socialist walking with the the rod of righteousness that was given him by Haile Selassie looks at the ambassador and is like, "You like what I'm saying, right?" That total submission. Even if you had the conviction, because the structural impediments were impossible. And now the politics of saying that the absolute maximum that we can hope for is reversing some forms of discrimination, which, of course, relative to Trump and white nationalism, is an absolute moral and policy necessity, but is never going to address the overall underlying exploitation systems that prop those racisms and sexisms and misogyny and all the rest of it.
That's right.
So get us though to why single payer is not only right in that context and an act of confidence, but it opens the space for us because it creates our own opening for contradictions on the other side that we can exploit as aggressive, confident leftists.
That's right. So really what you pointed out there in that shift in rhetoric and Bill de Blasio lately is this: there's a return of this what I call right now a social democratic ethos,
right, which
has not been seen for a very long time. And this Medicare for all, in particular the bill put forward by Senator Sanders last week, it now has 15 plus signatories. I can't keep track. I was trying to find an updated list, couldn't find one, but a lot of people are signing on to this thing.
Yep.
It's the most popular policy on offer right now. It's polling up there alongside like Social Security, which has always been like one of the most insanely popular,
right.
Policies and benefits in American history. And so I'm calling this a return to a social democratic ethos. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that it's a return to this commonsensical knee-jerk reaction that, yeah, of course, the government should be responsible for the well-being of its citizenry. That's what a government should do, right? A democratic state should be obligated to look after the people that it allegedly represents, right? Instead of just subjugating those people to the dictates of the market, which is what we've seen under neoliberalism in the last 40 some odd years. And so Senator Sanders in this wave that you see in Occupy, in the wave that you see, coming out of the Bernie primary moment has really pushed that envelope to say, what does to ask? People are asking the question, right? What does the state owe us? Who is the state for? Is it for oil subsidies and Wall Street to bail them out, every now and then when they need a hand, or is it to make sure that that we're all taken care of and we look after one another? And that you're seeing a sea change there. And, Medicare for all is sort of becoming co-opted by some of the shysters that we should be very careful about, right? Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, even Elizabeth Warren to a certain extent, right? She enthusiastically voted for the defense appropriation bill, $700 billion or whatever it was to go bomb poor people, overseas, So we need to be very careful of these people about what their real intentions may or may not be. But we also should celebrate that they are incorporating our social democratic ethos into their policies, right? So the question then is, how do we frame this? Do we say, well, shit, Cory Booker is taking this thing up. Now we've lost the thread. It's not a left policy anymore. Right? I would say no. I say we need to re-envision, reimagine what we're fighting for here and look at the long game. Sure. Sick people should not die and suffer because they're poor. That is inhuman. It's immoral, and we should loathe it with every fiber of our being, right? As socialists, as lefties, as progressives, as principled humans. Right. But beyond that, right? This universal Medicare for all is giving labor the breathing space that it really needs to have a renaissance. So what do I mean by that? Since the 1950s and 1960s, the labor movement has desperately tried to decouple this link of healthcare from the boss, right? So, it's been a real impediment to labor organizing, to strike action, and so on and so forth, because people can't leave their job, because when you do that, you leave behind, oftentimes, if you're lucky nowadays, right? If you're lucky, you also leave behind a reasonable healthcare policy, which means your kids, your dependents,
you're vulnerable.
You're totally vulnerable to the vagaries of the market. And so when you decouple that relationship, you decouple that tie between the boss and healthcare, your livelihood, your well-being in that way. Right. You give workers the freedom and the capacities to start thinking about how to resist, this neoliberal onslaught, this class war, this one-sided class war that we've been, seeing for the last 40 some odd years. And so that's how we need to think about this, right? That's how we turn the corner. That's how we fight for socialism for regular ass people. Right. It's not just about like winning healthcare because it's the right thing to do, which it is. It's also about seeing this as a puzzle piece towards a bigger picture, right? A longer game about providing universal, basic public goods for the people, because that's what democratic states should be doing, right? For and by the people, and this robust democratic ethos that any socialist movement is going to have to put forward.